maybe the mite has got a purpose, and at any rate, fighting it is just, it's just killing us. It's not the mite is, eventually the mite needs to be in relationship with the bee. And that reminded me of the odd little study done where they showed that there's a bacteria that can get in our stomach, that is in most of our stomachs, Helicobacter pylori. And that when it gets out of control, it can cause ulcers. And so there's various antibiotics that they can give you that kill that bacteria, and it can help stop the ulcer. But when people don't have any of that bacteria in their stomach, they tend to be more prone to asthma. We don't know why. But it's that bacteria that we think of as a bad thing, in balance serves a purpose. So this is, how do we find balance? We need to learn, instead of learning to just pour chemicals and say, there, we fixed that problem. We need to learn, well, no, there's a balance here. And maybe we have to pour a little bit of chemical once in a while, but if we can keep the balance right, we hardly ever have to use those kinds of really harsh measures. And that we can all rise together. We can have healthy lives, and our children and our grandchildren. That's what I'd like to see. And I feel like beekeepers are the vanguard of that. And we've pretty well proven, and people, when I say we, people like John Kiefer with thousands of hives in France and Chile that is treatment-free. We've shown that we can, and he's a PhD entomologist from Ohio State. He's been living in France most of his adult life. He's married to a French woman. But he can show with lots of data that mite resistance in bees is the best way to go. He talked to one Canadian beekeeper whose miticide budget was $150,000. So he spent $150,000 a year on Apistan or Coumaphos or whatever. And he said, just think what you could do with $150,000 if you didn't make it into a poison that actually hurts your bees.
What was the name of this man?
John Kiefer.
Kiefer?
Yeah, you can look him up on the internet. He has this cool thing, he calls it the World Mite Challenge, where you come and sleep on his hay and he'll eat your food. And you can look for mites in his hives all day, and he'll pay you a penny per mite. Cold hard cash, as he says. He's a cool, I really enjoyed, I was with him while he was in New Mexico for a while.
How would you spell his name?
K-E-F-U-S-S, possibly, but my spelling is like terrible.
Okay.
I'm a really bad speller. But usually I get it on the computer and then it says, oh, did you mean? And then, yeah, that's what I mean. Of course. Pollinate coffee. And the honey they make from it is slightly caffeinated. And the bees seem to really like the fact that it's slightly caffeinated. And it makes more coffee because they pollinate it and makes the coffee beans bigger and better. So that's a perfect balance, especially if you're going to have organic coffee, because if you're going to spray it, then we can't keep the bees there, right? Well, there's a group in Asia that is using, they're proposing to use bees to deliver a fungus similar to the fungus that bees use in the hive to preserve their pollen. So bees use good fungus in the beehive. They go and they gather pollen. They gather nectar and they gather pollen. The nectar goes in their honey tank and their pollen goes on their back legs. And we'll see it this afternoon. They pack it on these little, they make these little like pill heads on their back legs with these bright colors of pollen. They bring it in and they kick it off in certain cells that are designated for pollen. And when you look at those cells, like if you to see one, they tip up slightly, and you'll see layers of pollen that got rammed in there, and then maybe the last two nodules that just got loose that are still in the pellet form. Well, then there's a bee that her job is to go around and find all these recently knocked off pellets, and she just rams them with her head and smooths them out and smears them across the whole floor and makes a layer of that pollen. But she has a beneficial fungus on her head that is acidophilic. It likes an acid environment. And then she squirts a little bit of honey onto that pollen, and it makes it acidic. And this fungus proliferates. Turns out that this fungus stabilizes fatty acids. So pollen is full of fatty acids, and they would go rancid, like rancid butter. And this fungus keeps them from going rancid. And then the pollen has a pollen coat that our digestive system and bees' digestive system can't crack. And a lot of the nutrition is inside the coat. And the fungus cracks the pollen coat and stabilizes things inside, and then makes that all digestible, available to our digestion. So bees, when they store pollen, after they've stored it, it's like cheese that's instead of milk, right? They've made something completely different out of it. And they need that beneficial fungus. So now we put a bunch of bees in an almond orchard, and while the bees are there, while the trees are in full bloom, we soak it with the fungicide. We soak the pollen with the fungicide. Now the bees gather that soaked pollen, and they get it all over their bodies, and then they take it in, and they try to store their pollen, and the fungicide kills the good fungus, and it makes them susceptible to chalk brood, which is a fungal disease.
But we have protein patties that will take care of the
Yeah.
nutritional needs, right?
Right, and then we have Fumidale B to take care of the... And Fumidale B causes birth defects in humans. It's not allowed in any other country. And yet we use it here. We have to use it to stop chalk brood. Well, it's just ridiculous. That's a very powerful and it's a teratogenic, right? When it causes birth defects. Powerful chemical. So the whole thing, I feel like that's where the tower is starting to go, whoa, and those guys, they're quitting. They're going to stop. There's not enough money in the pollination business anymore. And everybody's trying to figure out how to shore them up and stop CCD, and the plight of the bee. But actually, we're keeping bees in the cities and the rural areas, away from the big farms, make a decision. Because when a colony makes a decision, it's some form of a consensus of a certain number of the workers. It's not the queen. She isn't like, go thee forth and let's go there. She has no idea where they're going. She doesn't know how to evaluate a hive location. So what he did is he took a swarm of bees, shook them out of a hive, and he took them off to an island off of Maine where there wasn't any place to live, just a little rocky kind of knoll. And he set up graduate students with walkie-talkies, with boxes, and he would then pour the swarm onto this board that he could actually, it had, measuring like crosshatch and X and Y and quadrants and everything, and he could watch the bees, and a bee would go off and it would come into one of the boxes, and a graduate student would say, "Oh, I got a bee," and she would mark it green, say. And then they would actually have ways of watching the bee inside the box, and the bee would walk around and evaluate the volume of the box to determine if it was big enough. And so they tried different volumes, and they found that the bees preferred about 40 liters or 10 gallons roughly, and that much bigger they didn't like and much smaller they didn't like. So they'd go in and do that, and so they'd make them all the same except different volume, and they found that they always went to the certain volume, because another bee would go to another place and evaluate it, and that graduate student would be there and mark it yellow, and then they'd come back and he'd say, "Oh, here's the green one, yeah, and it's doing a dance so many degrees from the sun so far right where you are, and I'm going to mark all the ones that are watching the dance," and then pretty soon they'd show up over there, and then they'd go back and report again, and so they'd go through this process of reporting from all these different locations, and pretty soon one would drop out. Well, that wasn't that great. Didn't attract very many new recruits. And then another would fall out. And pretty soon they're all dancing one dance, and then all of a sudden the swarm breaks up and goes there. So the creature is the colony, and it made a decision. And he's trying to figure out how it goes about its decision making. Well, he recently was concerned because he's a fan of natural bees, like just not being kept by people. Just how do they live at their own devices. And so he studies up in near Cornell University. There's a forest near there, and there are feral colonies, and they've kind of slowed down and almost disappeared when the varroa mite came, and now they're back, and they're thriving. And so he said, well, they must be mite resistant. But then there's kept colonies in some areas on the edge of the forest, and he was worried that the genetics of the kept bees were going to interfere with the feral populations. So he took genetic samples over the course of a couple of years, found out it's exactly the opposite. The feral colonies are exporting their genes to the kept colonies. The kept colonies, the drones are lacking fertility. they don't live as long, the queens are less fertile, the workers don't live as long, and they're just genetically dying off. And it's the feral bees that are strong and vibrant, and they're sending their genes to us. So to me, that was a perfect example of how we need to proceed. Even if you think, oh, I don't like the feral bees, they're too Africanized, or whatever you want to call it. Well, you have no choice. They're here. And they're the bees that apparently have adapted themselves to Santa Barbara, or New Mexico, or New York, or wherever you are, right? And there's another enemy that you don't want to fight. You want to realize how to make it your friend. And there are aspects of Africanization that are tough. So I was just talking to a friend in Los Angeles, and she went to do a bee removal. She does lots of bee removals. And she went to one where there were so many bees on my veil I could hardly see. Bee venom smell just thick in the air. That I could hear kids, across the fence. And she thought, I'm just going to have to back away and call an exterminator. And I hated to do it, but this colony was way too hot. And so in Brazil, they've been dealing with that for 50 years, and they've got very gentle Africanized bees. They've been breeding with them for all that time. And I think they could lead the way for us. I would even advocate in going and getting semen from Brazilian drones, African bees, and experimenting with them somewhere, and just seeing if there was a way to jumpstart take advantage of their breeding, and then we can ask the rest of agriculture to do the same. And as long as we're using treatments, we can't really complain about insecticides, is my opinion. Okay, and that we're smart enough that we can do that, and we're going to do it. We're already doing it. Okay, a lot of people are already doing it, and so that's kind of where I come from as a beekeeper. When I went and lived in Ecuador for a couple of years and decided, oh, I really like it. This happens to me everywhere I go. I think, oh, I could live here. And so I thought, okay, I'll go back to New Mexico and I'll finish my degree in biology, and then I'll go back to live in Ecuador. Well, I wound up staying in New Mexico, and happily so. But I read an article about a Topbar hive. And I had just been reading about how, so Dr. Jaycox, Albert Jaycox, was a PhD from University of Illinois, a bee scientist, honeybees. All of his life was dedicated to honeybees. And he was the one that did that research over how the concentric cocoons and the defecation make the combs bad for the bees. He recommended that you hold your combs up to the sky when it's kind of sunny, and if you can't see any light through them, you should get them out of the brood nest and cull them and melt them down for beeswax, because they weren't good for the bees. They increased foul brood, chalk brood, other brood diseases. They decreased honey production. They decreased brood production, so you didn't get as many, cycles per month or whatever. And so it was clear that the old combs needed to go. And so I had about 200 Langstroth hives at the time, and every year I was cutting the old comb out. I was using beeswax foundation with wire, the horizontal wires. I wasn't, well, okay, I get, that's my, I'm somewhat dyslexic, okay, so I get left and right and horizontal and vertical mixed up. But anyway, the wires that go up and down, that's vertical, right? Yeah, okay. So I'd have to cut them out, scrape out the old wax, put in new sheets of foundation. And it was a lot of work. And I read this article about a Topbar hive, and I thought, well, that's cool. I wonder how that would work. And they gave no dimensions. So, but the more I thought about it, I've got to try that. That just sounded so cool. Like, you don't have to make frames anymore. I would set up and, with a jig and go, and I would borrow a pneumatic nail gun, and but still making 1,000 frames is a pain in the rear. And so, and all the foundation, it costs money, so that would be really cool. So I built a few Topbar hives, and since it didn't give dimensions, I started experimenting. I figured out if it had to be, say, a Langstroth hive with 3 deep supers, what would be the volume? And so how would I make that volume cubic inches wise in a Topbar hive? And I came up with a plan. You change the volume. And when you get to 120, is when you get the most volume, and then it goes down. That's the maximum volume for the bottom and the two sides. 120, I was building a house at the time, and I was using adobes, and I decided I was make it hexagonal. You know, my dad lived a lot with Navajos and Hogans, and you know, we had round room. It was just one room, but it was round, and I liked that. And so I thought, well, I'll make it hexagonal, and so I wound up with 8 hexagons and eventually a 3-bedroom house. But the interior angle of a hexagon is 120 degrees. So, well, then I'm going to use it, you know. Well, also, I at one point made some wicker hives out of willows. So I just weave very loosely. I'm not good at it, but I'm better now than I learned in Jamaica how to do wicker better. But so I just made this very loose willow wicker on 4 sticks, two long sticks and 2 short sticks, and just hung like a, you know, half-round trough, or maybe somewhat parabolic trough, under these sticks, and put top bars on it, and then I mudded it with straw clay, cob. So you just take grass hay and soak it in a clay slip for a while, and then just plastered it inside, because the willows were real loose and had big holes, and I just filled in the holes. And then I was worried that the mud would stick to the comb when I lifted it, and I'd have mud in the honey, because I crushed the comb, and I might get mud in the honey. So, you know, I wanted to see how it went. Well, the bees would propolize the mud ahead of where they were building, and it was like a ceramic, clean, hard material. It was really nice. And a friend of mine saw me doing that, and he said, that's way too much work. And he made me, he went to the dairy nearby, where they have barrels of teat dip that they sell for $8. The empty barrel they sell for $8. And it's food approved. That doesn't mean it's safe. You know, I've learned these days that doesn't mean necessarily much, but it's an iodine salt, you know, and it rinses out real well. And we just dip the teats after the machines come off the teats, you know. And so he rinsed them out, and he screwed them to pieces of PVC pipe, and he put top bars on them and gave them to me and said, here's 12. He made me 12 of them. He got 6 barrels. So. And I thought, well, the bees aren't going to like those. Those are plastic, you know. They don't breathe at all. That's just, and how long do they last? You know, I wasn't very enthused, but I thanked him, and I decided to modify one just in case, because he made the top bars too wide, and I'll get into that in a minute. But finally, I got to this situation where I was out of boxes to put bees in, and I put a swarm in that, and the bees took off, and they built these beautiful half-round combs. You know, they're deep, they're big. You know, I think the bars were 24 inches across, or 26 inches, I forget. You know, they were big barrels, and so that was about 30 years ago, and I recently drove down there. I sold the piece of property, and I just recently drove through there. I have to resell it, turns out. So, and the neighbors on either side had picked up those plastic blue barrel hives, and they're still using them, and they still have bees in them. And I thought, well, you know, who am I to say what the bees will like or don't like? I had decided they shouldn't use plastic. I'm not fond of plastic, but at any rate, you know, you can use anything to make a top bar hive practically. You can make a top bar hive out of stone, out of adobe, out of wood, out of, you know, you could literally put me in the Amazon basin, and I could figure out how to weave a top bar hive and get some bees in it, and I would be in business, you know, and get myself something to eat. Like I just recently broke some comb, and it was full of pollen, and this is stored pollen. It's way better. You know, you should try it someday. Get some pollen that they've got in the comb and eat it like that. It's got this delicious taste. It's very nutritious, very high in protein, and I could eat. You know, so so how does a beehive work in general, and then we'll kind of get into specifics of top bar hive.